The sound of a shovel hitting wood is distinct. It is a hollow, dull thud. In the early months of 897 AD, deep inside the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, that sound echoed off the stone walls. It was January. The air in Rome was freezing, wet, and heavy with the smell of the marshes. Inside the crypt it was pitch black, save for the light of a few flickering torches held by men who did not want to be there. They were grave diggers. They were used to death. They were used to the smell of decay. But they weren't used to this. They weren't digging a grave. They were opening one, and they weren't robbing a peasant or a merchant. They were desecrating the tomb of a pope. The order had come from the highest level, from the throne of St. Peter itself. The new pope, Stephen VI, had commanded them to go down into the dark, find the sarcophagus of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, and drag him out. Formosus had been dead for 7 months. If you know anything about biology, you know what 7 months in a damp stone crypt does to a human body. The skin turns to leather. The fats saponify into a gray, wax-like sludge. The eyes are gone. The structure collapses in on itself, but the men kept digging. They pried open the lid. The smell hit them first, a physical wall of putrefaction that even the incense couldn't hide. They reached in. They grabbed the vestments, the gold-threaded silk that was now stained and rotting, and they pulled. Tonight we are talking about the Cadaver Synod. It is the single most grotesque moment in the history of the Catholic Church. It is a story so grim, so absurd, and so horrifying that the Vatican tried to erase it from history for centuries. But to understand why a living pope would put a dead pope on trial, we have to understand the city. Forget the Rome you see in movies. Forget the white marble of Caesar or the pristine dome of the Renaissance. Rome, in the 9th century, was a corpse. Historians call this era the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. The great aqueducts had broken, turning the city into a swamp. Malaria carried by mosquitoes killed more popes than poison did. The Colosseum was overgrown with vines and used as a landfill. Cows grazed in the Roman Forum, wandering between the fallen columns of temples. The population had collapsed from 1 million to maybe 30,000. They lived in hovels built into the ruins of the ancient palaces. They were starving, superstitious, and violent. And the papacy? The papacy wasn't a holy institution. It was a gang war. The Vatican was controlled by rival aristocratic families, the Spoleto faction and the German faction. They fought over the papacy like dogs fighting over a bone. Being pope didn't mean you were the holiest man in Europe, it meant you were the guy who survived the knife fight. Enter Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was a desperate man. He had been elected by the Spoleto faction, the violent local Italian mob. But his position was weak. He was terrified that the German emperor was going to march south and crush him. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to prove that the previous pope, Formosus, who had sided with the Germans, was illegitimate. If Formosus was a fraud, then everything Formosus did was void. The crowning of the German emperor? Void. The laws he passed? Void. But there was a problem. Formosus was dead. Most rational men would have just burned the records. They would have forged some documents. But Stephen VI was not a rational man. He was consumed by a specific macabre paranoia. He believed that he couldn't just say Formosus was guilty. He had to prove it in a court of law. And under Roman law, the accused must be present to answer the charges. So Stephen gave the order. Get the shovel. Back in the crypt, the grave diggers finished their work. They hauled the body of Formosus out of the stone coffin. It was a horrific sight. The body was rigid. The papal robes were fused to the decaying skin. They didn't wrap him in a sheet. They didn't treat him with reverence. They dragged him up the stairs. Imagine the scene. The torches flickering, the shadows dancing on the walls, the sound of the dead Pope's heels dragging across the stone floor of the basilica. They brought him into the sacristy. And then the true horror began. They didn't wash him, they simply dressed him. Stephen ordered his aides to dress the rotting corpse in the full ceremonial regalia of the papacy. They had to force the stiff skeletal arms into the sleeves of the tunicle. They placed the pallium, the sacred woolen band of authority, over his shoulders. They shoved his feet into the red papal slippers, and finally they placed the heavy jeweled tiara on his head. It must have been a nightmare to behold. A skeleton draped in gold and silk, smelling of the grave, sitting slumped in a chair. The flesh on his face was receding, giving him a permanent skeletal grin. But Stephen wasn't done. He ordered the corpse to be carried across Rome to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, where the trial would take place. It was a procession of madness. The citizens of Rome, peering out of their crumbling homes, watched as the Pope's guard carried a litter through the muddy streets. But instead of a living pontiff waving to the crowd, there was a dark shape smelling of death bobbing up and down in the torchlight. They arrived at the basilica. The cardinals were waiting. These were hardened men. They had seen plagues, they had seen executions, but as the doors opened and the smell of Formosus drifted into the nave, many of them began to shake. They knew what was coming. They knew that Stephen had lost his mind. But they also knew that Stephen had the guards, and he had the swords. So they sat in their pews. They watched as the corpse was carried up the aisle. They watched as it was propped up on a throne. And they watched as Pope Stephen VI, red-faced and trembling with rage, walked up to the dead man, looked him in the eye sockets, and began to scream. The Basilica of St. John Lateran is a massive, echoing space. On a normal day, it smells of beeswax candles and frankincense. But on this day, in January 897, the incense was fighting a losing battle. The church was filled with the heavy, cloying scent of the grave. The cardinals sat in the front rows, holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, trying not to gag. They kept their eyes fixed on the floor, terrified to look up at the apse. Because sitting on the throne where the vicar of Christ should be was a monster. Pope Formosus had been propped up on the cathedra, but the rigors of death are not kind to posture. His body likely listed to one side, his head heavy with the golden tiara probably lolled against his shoulder. The skin on his face was gray and papery, pulled tight over the bone. And, standing next to him, shaking like a leaf, was a teenage deacon. We don't know this boy's name. History didn't record it. But he had the worst job in the history of the Catholic Church. He had been appointed as the defense counsel. His job was to stand behind the corpse, lean in close to the rotting ear, pretend to listen, and then speak the answers for the dead pope. Pope Stephen VI stood in the center of the aisle. He was trembling, not with fear, but with a manic, frothing rage. He pointed a finger at the corpse. "Why did you usurp the universal Roman see?" he screamed. "Why did you claim this office when you were already the Bishop of Porto?" The question echoed off the stone walls. Silence. The corpse stared back with empty sockets. Stephen took a step closer. "Answer me." The teenage deacon, pale and sweating, leaned down to the dead man. He hesitated. Then, in a small, cracking voice, he stammered out the defense. I felt unworthy, but the Holy Spirit compelled me. It was a farce, a grotesque puppet show. Stephen wasn't satisfied. He began to pace. He screamed legal arguments at the skeleton. He cited canon law from centuries ago. He accused Formosus of perjury. He accused him of coveting the papacy. He accused him of violating the laws of the church councils. Every time Stephen paused for breath, the deacon would mumble a weak rebuttal. Not guilty. I served God. The cardinals watched in horror. This wasn't just a trial, it was a sacrilege. In the Catholic faith, the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. To treat a consecrated pope like this was to spit in the face of God. But Stephen was beyond theology. He was in a frenzy. He was screaming at a mirror of his own insecurity. The trial lasted for hours. The winter light faded outside. The shadows in the basilica grew longer. The smell grew worse as the heat of the candles warmed the air. Finally, the verdict was delivered. To the surprise of absolutely no one, Pope Formosus was found guilty on all counts. Stephen declared him unworthy. He declared his papacy null and void. Every priest Formosus had ordained, every bishop he had consecrated, every law he had passed, all of it was erased. But a legal verdict wasn't enough for Stephen. He wanted physical revenge. He gave the signal to his guards. Strip him. The guards stepped forward. This was the moment the Synodus Horrenda turned from a courtroom drama into a butchery. They tore the sacred vestments off the body. The silk stuck to the decaying skin. As they ripped the robes away, pieces of the Pope came with them. They stripped him down to a hair shirt, the rough undergarment of a penitent sinner. Then Stephen ordered the ultimate humiliation. In the Catholic tradition, a pope blesses the faithful with 3 fingers of his right hand, the thumb, index, and middle finger. These are the fingers that hold the Eucharist. They are the conduits of God's grace. Stephen drew a knife, or perhaps he ordered a butcher to do it. The accounts vary, but the act is the same. They grabbed the dead, withered right hand of Formosus. They forced the stiff fingers open, and with a few brutal hacks they severed the 3 fingers of benediction. The dried bones clattered onto the marble floor. "Take him away!" Stephen screamed. The guards grabbed the body by the ankles. The head thumped against the floor. They dragged him out of the basilica, leaving a trail of dust and grave mold on the sacred stones. The teenage deacon was left standing alone by the empty throne, likely traumatized for life. But the horror wasn't over. Stephen didn't just want Formosus condemned, he wanted him erased. This is the Roman concept of damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. They dragged the body through the streets of Rome. The mob, whipped up by Stephen's soldiers, threw stones at it. They jeered at the anti-pope. Finally, they reached a graveyard for strangers and criminals, a pit for the unwanted. They threw the mutilated body into a shallow hole and covered it with dirt. Stephen returned to the Lateran palace triumphant. He had won. He had rewritten history. He had proven his enemy was a fraud. He sat on the throne, secure in his power. But Rome is an old city, and Rome believes in omens. Just a few days after the trial, the ground began to shake. A tremor ripped through the city. It wasn't a massive earthquake, but it was targeted. At the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very site of the trial, the roof over the altar cracked. The stones groaned, and then a massive section of the ceiling collapsed, smashing into the nave right where the corpse had sat. The people of Rome stopped jeering. They looked at the rubble, they looked at the Vatican, and they whispered, "God is watching." And God apparently was not amused. The earthquake changed everything. In medieval Rome, nature wasn't just weather or geology. It was the voice of God. When the ceiling of the basilica collapsed, the people of Rome didn't see structural failure. They saw divine anger. They began to whisper that Stephen VI had gone too far. It was one thing to be a corrupt politician. It was another thing entirely to desecrate the dead so violently that the earth itself rejected the trial. Pope Stephen, sitting in the Lateran Palace, felt the mood shifting. He was paranoid. He realized that burying Formosus in a pauper's grave wasn't enough. As long as the body existed, it was a threat. It was a relic. So, incredibly, he ordered the body dug up again. You have to appreciate the level of hatred involved here. Formosus had been dead for months, exhumed, put on trial, mutilated, buried in a pit. And now, just a few days later, Stephen wanted him evicted a second time. He ordered his guards to drag the corpse out of the grave. This time there would be no burial. There would be no stone. He ordered them to throw the Pope into the Tiber River. For a Roman, this was the ultimate insult. The Tiber was the sewer of the city. It was where they threw criminals, traitors, and garbage. To be denied burial and washed out to sea meant your soul would never find rest. The guards weighed the body down with weights and tossed it off a bridge. The dark, muddy waters swallowed Pope Formosus. Stephen VI dusted off his hands. Problem solved. But the Tiber is a winding, unpredictable river, and it refused to cooperate. A few days later, a monk was walking along the riverbank near the port of Ostia, miles downstream. He saw something snagged in the reeds. He waded into the water. He pulled the bundle ashore. It was a body. It was missing 3 fingers. It was still wearing the tattered remains of a hair shirt. The monk recognized him immediately. He didn't run away. He didn't report it to Stephen. He hid the body. And then, the rumors started. Fishermen began to say that when the body of Formosus touched their nets, the catch was miraculous. Old women whispered that the dead pope had performed miracles on the riverbank. They said that even the water respected him. The whispers grew into a roar. The Spoleto faction, Stephen's backers, began to lose control of the streets. The Roman mob, which had cheered the trial just a week ago, suddenly decided they loved Formosus. They looked at Stephen VI, this frothing, screaming man who mutilated skeletons, and they decided he wasn't the vicar of Christ. He was a usurper. The revolution happened fast. In the summer of 897, the mob stormed the Lateran Palace. They overpowered the guards. They didn't put Stephen on trial. They didn't exhume his ancestors. They just grabbed him. They stripped him of his papal robes, a poetic justice considering what he had done, and threw him into a dungeon. Stephen, the man who thought he could judge the dead, died alone in a dark cell. He wasn't executed publicly. He was strangled by a common criminal. It was a grim, quiet end to a loud, messy life. With Stephen dead, the madness broke. The next pope, Romanus, and then Theodore II, immediately reversed the verdict of the Cadaver Synod. They declared that the trial was insane. They declared that you cannot, in fact, sue a corpse. They retrieved the body of Formosus from the monk who was hiding it. And then they held one final procession. Imagine this scene. It is late 897. The streets of Rome are lined with people again, but this time they aren't jeering. They are silent. They are reverent. The body of Formosus, now battered by water, time, and violence, is carried back into St. Peter's Basilica. They dressed him in new robes. They didn't put him on a throne, they put him in a tomb. Pope Theodore II performed a mass over the body. And legend says, because Rome always needs a legend, that as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the statues of the saints in the basilica bowed their heads in respect. Formosus was back. He had survived death, trial, mutilation, and the river. He was once again a pope in good standing, but history has a dark sense of humor. 10 years later, another pope, Sergius III, took power. Sergius hated Formosus. He overturned the overturning. He declared the Cadaver Synod was valid again. He put a plaque on Stephen's tomb praising him for punishing the wicked Formosus. For a century, the Vatican argued back and forth about whether the skeleton was guilty or innocent. But eventually, the Church realized that the whole thing was an embarrassment. They quietly stopped talking about it. They buried the story just as deep as they buried the bodies. Today, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, you can find a list of all the popes engraved on a massive marble slab. Formosus is there. Stephen VI is there. They are just names on a wall now. The hatred, the screaming, the digging, the river, none of it matters anymore. They are just two lines of text next to each other in the dark. The Cadaver Synod is a reminder of a very simple, very drowsy truth. You can scream at the past all you want. You can put it on trial, you can drag it through the streets, but in the end, the dead always win. They have more patience. Thank you for digging through the archives with me tonight. I hope you found this little excursion into the macabre relaxing, in a strange sort of way. I'm going to go wash my hands. I feel like I've got grave dirt under my fingernails just talking about this. Sleep well, and sometimes it's best to let the past stay buried.